Thank you. The Honourable Member for Folkestone and Hyde, the Chair of the Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Committee, has tabled a motion for debate on a matter of privilege which the Speaker has agreed should take precedence today. I call Damian Collins to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to you and the Speaker for allowing the precedence of this motion being debated today. As we all know, it is the function of this House not just to vote on and pass legislation and to debate bills and matters of public interest, but also to hold government ministers to account. There can probably be no parliament in the world that provides more consistent, more close scrutiny of the work of government ministers than the House of Commons does. But it is the work also of select committees to continue that scrutiny, to again question and hold ministers to account. And indeed, there are plenty of ministers who have got themselves into trouble as a result of evidence they've given to select committees. But the additional privilege of the select committees is not just to question members of the government, but to call anyone whose role and position and power in society makes them a matter of interest and a subject of interest for our inquiries. And it is the ability and the power of the committees to invite people to give evidence and to issue a summons where necessary for them to appear to give evidence is vital to the work of select committees of this House. I believe, and having checked this with the clerks of my committee and with the House of Commons Library, that this is the first time since 1920 that a motion of this kind has been put before the House. And it has not been done lightly, and in some ways it is done with regret, because I wish we had not come to this point and we could have reached a successful conclusion to the invitation we issued to Dominic Cummings before now. Before I continue with my remarks, it might be helpful to the House just to explain why it is that we are in this position now. The Select Committee in March issued an initial invitation to Dominic Cummings to give evidence to the committee as part of our investigation into disinformation and fake news. I should state that we are not conducting an inquiry into the referendum. We are not seeking to invite people that have worked on referendum campaigns for the Brexit referendum to give evidence or to scrutinise the details of those campaigns. We are conducting an inquiry into which a very important part of that inquiry has been the use of data in the course of campaigning. During the course of our investigations, other witnesses have come forward and made allegations about the work of Vote Leave. And as Dominic Cummings was the Communications Director, he is the person most fit to speak on that. In many ways, what we are seeking to do is to extend a privilege that many committees do extend to witnesses, which is where an allegation is made about them or their organisation, that they have the ability to come in front of the committee and to refute those allegations and to present alternative evidence. And that is the opportunity we wish to give Dominic Cummings. But we also believe that it is the right of the committee to have the opportunity to question him based on evidence that we have already received. We were unable to reach a satisfactory conclusion in the invitations that we issued to Mr Cummings. As a result of that, we proceeded to issue a formal summons passed by the committee. Mr Cummings not only refused to accept that summons and to appear on the named day issued in the summons, he refused to consider alternative dates with which he might appear and which the committee might have agreed to. He also made it clear in public remarks that he had no intention of ever coming to give evidence to this committee and resented the way in which he had been treated. That left the committee with no alternative but to seek to report this matter to the House and to seek the support of the whole House of Commons, not just the DCMS Select Committee, to support a motion ordering Mr Cummings to appear in front of our committee. We felt that Mr Cummings had taken the view that appearing in front of a House of Commons Select Committee is not really a matter for that committee, but entirely at the discretion of the proposed witness. That it is up to him to set the time and the date, even though that may be months after our inquiry has been finished. That not only restricts our right and our ability to question witnesses who have important information linked to our inquiries, but also to fail to give us the opportunity to question people based on evidence that has been received and tabled against them. Now, is our relationship with Mr Cummings uniquely bad? Have we treated him unkindly, whereas other committees of the House may have treated him more favourably? He's even suggested he will be willing to come at his discretion at some point in the future to give evidence to another committee. Well, it's interesting to note that, of course, Mr Cummings has given evidence to the House of Commons Select Committees before. He gave evidence to the Treasury Select Committee in the last Parliament. And it is relevant, I think, to look at their report following the evidence that he gave. They took evidence from a number of parties and campaigns involved in the Brexit referendum to analyse the arguments they were making. In Chapter 7 of their report, in paragraph 236, which I will read, I think sets out the similar frustrations they had, even though he agreed to give witness. And that report of the Treasury Select Committee says, in their treatment of this committee, neither Mr Elliott, also from Vote Leave, nor Mr Cummings as individuals have fulfilled Vote Leave's commitment made in their successful application to the Electoral Commission to create a valuable legacy for the UK's democratic process. Their conduct has been appalling. Mr Elliott and Mr Cummings' express view that the powers should be restored to Parliament sits ill with this conduct. It goes on to say, it was the committee's preference to hear both Vote Leave and Leave.eu in one sitting. In the end, it took 3. If Mr Elliott and Mr Cummings consider that the committee's evidence-taking process has been protracted, uncomfortable or harmful to their cause, they have only themselves to blame. The committee notes that Mr Banks and Mr Tice of Leave.eu did not seek to attach any conditions to their attendance. That is very similar to the experience that we've had as well, because as a consequence of evidence we've received, we've also asked other people to give evidence to the committee. We've asked Mr Banks and Mr Wigmore from Leave.eu to give evidence. They've agreed to do that next week. We asked Aggregate IQ, the tech company from Canada that Leave.eu used to work on its campaign. They have given evidence to this committee, even though the person giving evidence is a Canadian national based in Canada, out of the jurisdiction of this Parliament, of no obligation at all in any way to attend, but nevertheless crossed an ocean to do so. And yesterday the committee took evidence from Alexander Nix of Cambridge Analytica, returning to give evidence to the committee about linked and relevant issues as well. So it seems to be that we have a unique problem in requiring Dominic Cummings to come and give evidence to us. And I do not believe, and the members of my committee do not believe, that that is an acceptable state of affairs. These are incredibly serious matters. There's a certain irony that someone who was the communications director of Leave.eu, who ran a successful campaign to seek to restore powers to Parliament, seems to hold that institution himself in such contempt. Yes.
The honourable gentleman has perhaps issued his notice to Mr Cummings, perhaps on the side of a bus. I think he might have seen it and come to Parliament.
I won't go down that road, but, or follow his bus. But as I said, this is not necessarily directly about that campaign. But I think it's a certain irony that someone who campaigned to restore powers to Parliament is not willing to come to Parliament to give evidence in front of one of its committees. And someone in his campaign who was so critical, and many would say rightly so, of European civil servants and bureaucrats exercising power remotely, unelected, unaccountable to any institutions. But here we have someone who held a very, very important position in this country during a very, very important campaign. We believe we have important questions to put to him about them, and he declines to appear. Now, he did suggest in his initial communications that he might appear when we invited him in March, at some point later in July. He subsequently said in his public statements that he won't appear until other investigations have been concluded, the investigations being conducted by the Electoral Commission, by the Information Commissioner in particular. Now, there are rules that prevent committees calling witnesses, but those are normally restricted to matters that are before the courts. This matter is not sub judice. Mr Cummings has not been charged with any offence. He is not in proceedings before the courts. We sought guidance from the Electoral Commission and the Information Commissioner as well to ask if we called him to give evidence, given they have ongoing inquiries, would that in any way undermine the work of their inquiries and investigations? And they again have said no, that they would welcome it if Mr Cummings gave evidence to the Select Committee. So there is no founded excuse there as well. His decision not to come, whatever he says, is one of his own making. It's a deliberate attempt to deny Parliament its right to question witnesses on matters of importance. And that is why we bring in the motion before the House today, to stand up on an important point of principle and to support the work of the Select Committees and their inquiries across Parliament, to maintain the right that we should have to call witnesses that we believe are important to our work and the public interest to give evidence in front of us.
The question is as on the order paper. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to support the motion, and I don't want to debate the issues that give rise to the Select Committee's request for Mr Cummings to appear, because I think the whole House would agree those are properly matters for the committee, and I trust the Chair and the members to do their job with their usual diligence and care. The reason I wanted to contribute very briefly to this debate was on the question of the power of Select Committees to ensure that witnesses do turn up, which is the point of principle that, quite properly, is now going to be referred to the Privileges Committee. Mr Cummings is clearly refusing to do so, although he has appeared previously before committees, and I agree absolutely with the Chair of the Select Committee when he said a moment ago that Mr Cummings was showing contempt for the House. Indeed, the phrase in his letter of the 11th of May, and I quote, "As you know, you have no powers to compel my attendance, and your threats are empty, or this email exchange at the very end of the report in which he says, I'm calling your bluff. Your threats are empty. Say what you like. I will not come to your committee regardless of how many letters you send or whether you send characters in fancy dress to hand me papers. Now, there's a very important point of principle at stake here, which the House has debated in the past and will need to debate again. What do we do when witnesses refuse to appear? Now, this has been looked at by a number of reports from my honourable friend, who I think is also looking to catch your eye, is a great expert in these matters. There have been 2 substantive reports, I think, in 1999 and 2013, on whether we should legislate. Because there's much discussion. At the time of the Murdochs, there was a lot of discussion about what had happened in the past, powers that have fallen into abeyance. And there are 2 views. The first view says, in the end, almost everybody who has initially refused to appear turns up. And the Messrs Murdoch, I think, is a very good example of that. I'm not sure how I think it was the Assistant Sergeant of Arms was dressed on the occasion that the journey was made across to Wapping with a notice requiring attendance, because it is true that for many people, and the argument is forcefully made, the threat to their reputation of not appearing is what, in the end, obliges them to turn up. And the second argument against legislating to give us some power is fear that the courts will interfere in the functioning of Parliament. And I understand that argument, but I have to say I come down on the other side, because if we end up in a situation where one witness can get away with not appearing, and if it catches on with other witnesses, if you think of the really important role that Parliament has played recently in calling in, they may regard themselves as private individuals, but the chairs and chief executives of major companies that have done things that have impacted hugely on the lives of our citizens, if it comes to pass that people think I don't have to turn up, then how can we continue to do our job as select committees and as Parliament in holding the powerful to account? And in the main, select committees, well, there are 2 types of witnesses. The powerful who are being held to account, and others who have information and expertise which can inform the work that we undertake. And therefore, I don't think, in supporting this motion and asking that the Privileges Committee should look at this, I don't think that we can accept a situation in which that is what transpires. Now, I'm advised that in, I think, Australia and New Zealand, they do have an offence of failing to appear. You can be fined, you can be imprisoned if you don't turn up as a witness. By the way, witnesses don't have to answer questions. They don't have to answer questions. Now, it would be quite an appearance to sit there and say, I decline to answer that question, the equivalent of taking the Fifth Amendment in front of a congressional committee in the United States of America. And I do not want the courts to be in a position where they start to question the reason why a witness has been called or what questions might be asked of them. And I would have thought it was perfectly possible to draft legislation which said, where a select committee has issued a requirement for a witness to appear and the witness does not turn up without reasonable excuse, then it is for the courts, not for Parliament, because I am not in favour of Parliament being able to fine people by a decision in this chamber or the Privileges Committee. I'm not in favour of Parliament being able to clap recalcitrants in irons. It would then be for the court to apply an appropriate penalty to the individual who failed to turn up. Because in those circumstances, I don't see actually how the courts can say, well, we want to go over the reasons why the Select Committee wanted to call this evidence, because it would be, I suppose, I'm not a lawyer, a kind of strict liability offence. Either you appear or you don't, if the summons has been issued by the House of Commons. And I do think this is an important point of principle, and this case, this unfortunate case, and the response of Mr Cummings, I think reminds us of the need to ensure that we end up with a system that doesn't allow the powerful and people who need to answer questions and to be held to account for what they have done in the normal, courteous manner that almost all select committees operate under. We cannot allow that to happen, because if we do, then we cannot do our job on behalf of the people who send us here. And I hope the Liaison Committee, having debated this recently, and we've as I understand it, we have sent to the Privileges Committee the view that, well, there are two sides to this argument, but it really needs to be looked at. I wanted to take this opportunity to say why I am in the argument, and I think we've got to ensure that when we call people, they turn up.
Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The select committees of this House do vital work on behalf of the people of the United Kingdom, and the Government is a strong supporter of the independence of the select committee system. I'd like to thank my honourable friend and the other members of the Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Committee for all their work on behalf of Parliament. Today's debate is not about the substantive issues under investigation by the Select Committee. It is about the right of Select Committees to undertake their duties as assigned to them by this House. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government has full respect for the privileges of the House of Commons, and we will continue to uphold them. They're crucial to the independence of Parliament and to the strength of our democracy. I therefore support this motion today.
Pete Wishart.
Deputy Speaker, as a fellow Select Committee Chair, can I wholeheartedly support the Honourable Gentleman, and I hope that this motion progresses and ensures that he does get the witness he requires. It's unfortunate that it has actually come to the stage and he's had to come to the House to request such a motion, and I think it's important that we all support him in these endeavours. It's absolutely imperative that Select Committees secure the witnesses that they feel they require to help in order to progress their inquiries. We think long and hard about who we are actually considering to bring in front of our committee. It's a process that's involved with our clerks, with fellow members of the committee, and we look to see who could possibly supply us with the best possible information that will then shape up and inform our inquiries. And it's important that we do get these people. But I support totally the remarks of the Honourable Gentleman from Leeds Central. We have to get an absolute determined process about what we do about reluctant witnesses, and I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman is on the liaison committee, as I have, and that we're currently considering that, and I hope that the Right Honourable Lady will be saying a few words as the Chair in the liaison committee about this now, just to see exactly where we are in terms of being able to get to a position where there is clarity about what we do with reluctant witnesses. We cannot have a situation in this House where we require people to help us with our reports and inquiries and who simply refuse to do it. And some of the extraordinary language that's been used by Mr Cummings in order to evade that responsibility is quite bizarre and shows nothing other than a contempt for the Honourable Gentleman's Committee and to this House with some of the language that's been used to try and evade that responsibility. We have been here before, Madam Deputy Speaker. We had the issue of the Murdochs, which has been raised. We in the Scottish Affairs Committee have had difficulty in securing witnesses. We have managed in the end to make sure that they have come before the committee. But can I say, it is not helped, Madam Deputy Speaker, by government ministers refusing to come before select committees too. Now, I just gave a report, and you listened very patiently to that, Madam Deputy Speaker, on bank closures. I could not get a Treasury Minister to come to my committee to answer questions about bank closures in Scotland. Now, I'm sure that people like Mr Cummings and others who are reluctant to come in front of select committees are observing that and saying, well, if government ministers won't come in front of select committees of this House, why should I? And I think we have to make sure that if government ministers are asked and requested to come in front of select committees, they come. And it's not good enough to say, this is not our responsibility and I answer to another select committee. If they're requested, they should come. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Him for giving way, and could I endorse what he's just said and say the same applies to senior officials as well? And it very nearly got to the point with the Defence Select Committee that we almost issued a summons before common sense broke through. So it does require government to set a good example, whether it's ministers or indeed senior officials.
And I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his comments, and I know that he has himself had these difficulties and issues about securing members of government, whether that's civil servants, senior officials, like they have to come in a committee, and I hope that this is something that we can take away from this, because I'm sure that all these reluctant witnesses, the length and breadth of the country, are observing what happens. Now, the only route is available to us is exactly what the Honourable Gentleman has done today, which is to get a motion in order to summons Mr Cummings to come to this committee, and then the process is to go to the Privilege Committee to make our ruling in terms of privilege in this House. We have to look at this and make sure that we can amend our practices and procedures which will allow us certainty when we're dealing with the reluctant witnesses. And if anything, what the Honourable Gentleman has done today, and I hope he gets his witness, I'm pretty certain he will after today's debate, and I'm sure he's observing what's happening and realising that the time is up and he should just agree to the Honourable Gentleman. But let's put in place a proper process for ensuring we get the people we need in front of our select committees.
Yeah. Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd just like to put on record my thanks to all of those who appear as witnesses before our select committees. Many of them do so knowing that they'll face a considerable level of challenge, but they come prepared to put their case on the public record. And they do so because they know that it's not just showing a contempt to this House to refuse to appear, but more importantly, a contempt to the public. Because the work that we carry out as select committees is on behalf of the public, and the House delegates to us, in almost every case, the ability to call for persons, papers and records. And I think that that's an extraordinarily important role that we have on behalf of the public. So I'd like to join my honourable friend in condemning the action of Dominic Cummings for the way he has behaved. I think it's a disgrace, frankly, and we should call it out. But I also think that we need to actually reflect on what we now do where individuals refuse. And I agree with the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central that it is time now. And I speak in a personal capacity because there is a difference of opinion on the pros and cons of how we should now take this forward. And I welcome the Privileges Committee's further inquiry into this. And there is a difference of opinion as to what the pitfalls would be in involving the courts. But ultimately, the experience of other jurisdictions, such as New Zealand and Australia, where there is now that final backstop, is that they haven't had to use it. And I think that there is a case for saying that where we don't have a final backstop, we are increasingly going to see examples like Mr Cummings refusing to answer to the British people and to Parliament, of course.
Also agree with me that if we have a situation where witnesses feel they're not obliged and compelled to come to select committee, they could be bribed or intimidated from not attending. Someone might have an interest in a witness not attending and bribe them or intimidate them.
Danger that people will increasingly come under pressure to actually make a judgment that the reputational damage is less by not appearing at all. And I think the Honourable Gentleman makes a very important point. But I do feel that we have now come to a point where having a final backstop of a penalty, and whether that be give way to my honourable friend.
Can I just say to the honourable lady, in her role as chairman of the Liaison Committee, that she was enormously helpful to the Defence Committee, as were the other members of the committee, in getting the senior official to agree to come and getting the Prime Minister to agree that he should come to the Defence Committee. And in the end, it was a very valuable session. I don't know Mr Cummings. I support his cause. And I believe that he is in danger of doing grave damage to the cause that he and I both support, because the effect of his refusal is far more damaging than anything that could happen at a hearing if he actually gave evidence. And can I finally appeal to her to stop using the word backstop, which at the moment is not really my favourite expression.
I thank my honourable friend for that point. Yes, it is the irony of, as all the point has been made before, that you want to call to restore powers to this Parliament, but actually not when it comes to yourself. The honourable gentleman is quite correct. Yes, give way.
I'm most grateful to the honourable lady giving way, and I'm pleased to see this motion on the order paper today. I serve on the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Select Committee, and we have often had to call witnesses before that Select Committee who perhaps were not quite as enthusiastic of attending as they should have been. But can I just say that I thought that there was, I don't know whether you would agree with me, there's a bit of a deficiency in this, because the motion on the paper before us today merely asks Mr Cummings to appear before the committee at a time or place. It does not actually ask him to appear and answer questions. And would it not have been better to have actually made that specific? Because it is, of course, in theory, possible for Mr Cummings to appear, but then not to answer any of the questions of the committee.
Sarah Willis.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her point, but even in other jurisdictions where people can be compelled to appear, they're not compelled necessarily to answer a question. But I do think that this is a grave contempt of this House, but as I say, more importantly, of the British people, for him to have behaved in the way that he has done. Of course.
If I may, and partly for the benefit of the record, yesterday Alexander Nix came back to the Select Committee to give evidence. We were concerned that he'd said things that were not consistent with evidence we'd received. He came back to correct the record and to answer our questions. He is also under investigation by the Electoral Commission and the Information Commission and other agencies and other jurisdictions. He managed the process perfectly well of answering questions where he felt he could and giving guidance where he felt there were things he couldn't answer. There were very few of those, but I think even with someone under investigation who's not yet been charged with an offence, it's perfectly possible to conduct a successful hearing.
I thank my honourable friend for that point. So in closing, I'd just like to again pay tribute to all those who do appear before our committees, and also to take the opportunity to thank all members of Select Committees for the work that they put in, and to all of our staff who do a magnificent job in supporting us. Thank you.
Deputy Speaker, I congratulate the Honourable Member for Folkestone and Hythe on bringing forward this motion. I think he's absolutely right. There are a whole series of ironies here. The man who derided unelected bureaucrats in Brussels now, as an unelected bureaucrat, refuses the public scrutiny by elected MPs. The man who coined the phrase "take back control" now defies Parliament when it tries to take back control. And the man who demanded Britain assert her independent sovereignty denies the sovereignty of Parliament. But I question in my mind whether this is irony or, frankly, isn't it just hypocrisy? And to be honest, I come to the conclusion that it's hypocrisy. I wonder to myself whether this is some high-minded act of principle. I think it's not. I think it's sheer cowardice. The point has been made that Rupert Murdoch chose to come in the end to the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee because he felt that his reputation might be harmed. Maybe Mr Cummings thinks that his reputation is now so poor that it couldn't possibly be harmed anymore. But in the end, I think the debate today is not particularly important because of Mr Cummings and his refusal to come. It's pretty clear that in everything that he said, either in the letters, the emails, or in his other public announcements, that he holds Parliament in complete and utter disdain. And in the past, we would have been very, very robust and more quickly so than we're being today. The real issue is that this poses a real question, as my honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, made absolutely clear. What do we do if, in the end, somebody point-blank refuses to come? The idea of sending the Sergeant-at-Arms is nice and quaint. Yes, undoubtedly, he can deliver a letter, but I don't think in the end he really has subpoena powers anymore. It's also slightly strange for a political body, in the end, to arrest somebody, which is, in effect, what you have to be able to do. The idea of politicians deciding on a political motion whether or not somebody should be arrested is, I'm glad to say, anathema under habeas corpus. We simply don't believe in that way of pursuing justice anymore. So that's why I say that I do think in the end we will have to legislate. We will have to make sure that there are proper bodies which operate through in full recognition of human rights legislation in this country and in the European Convention of Human Rights, and provide due process for somebody so that they are not just, so they cannot claim that they are simply being arrested on the political whim of politicians. And I very much, and I regret the fact that, as my honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, has already referred to, we've had two committees, a joint committee and a committee of this House, that have looked at this issue over the last 20 years. They came to different conclusions. They held their conclusions very, very firmly, and governments of different colours chose to do absolutely nothing about it. The coalition government, indeed produced a white paper on the matter and said it was going to legislate, and nothing has happened. I'm really delighted that the Leader of the House is here today, because I think in the end she knows, as everybody else must know here, that if one person decides not to come and gets away with it, and by getting away with it I mean either we choose to do absolutely nothing because the Privileges Committee decides that there's nothing we can do, or we decide, well, we're just going to issue a statement saying you're a very naughty boy. either of those is, to my mind, impunity. If that happens, every lawyer in the land for a big captain of industry will say there's no requirement for you to attend. The whole thing will be blown to pieces, and we will have lost an enormously important part of the way that we do our job. It was Norman Singer-Stevens who set up the modern select committee system. I think it's our pride and joy. It's one of, and some have argued in recent days that select committees should have the power to summon members of this House, government ministers, members of the Lords. Oddly enough, that's the one thing they don't have the power to do. But that they shouldn't have the power to summon private individuals. But I actually think that in the modern era, Parliament is there to redress grievances of our constituents, of the whole of the country. And often those grievances are not particularly against the powerful in government, they're against the powerful in every other aspect of our modern life, whether running our broadcasting companies, our newspapers, our big businesses, our greengrocers, our banks, whatever it may be. And we would be losing a phenomenally important tool in holding the great and the good and the powerful in this land to account if we were to surrender this by default. Now, in the end, I don't mind which way we legislate in, whether it's the conclusions of the Joint Committee or the or of the Select Committee. But I'm absolutely certain we will end up having to change the way we do our business. As the honourable member who speaks for the SNP on the 17th anniversary of his being an MP said earlier, we will have to do something, and I very much hope that the Leader of the House will take that away. We cannot allow impunity any longer.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.